There's a photograph that doesn't exist anymore. Not because it was destroyed, but because no one thought to take it. It would have captured the exact moment when comfort became a crime, when the sin wasn't poverty or wealth, but the unforgivable act of being precisely in between. You've felt this, haven't you? That creeping sensation that the ground beneath your feet is slowly dissolving, not into catastrophe, but into something far more insidious: irrelevance. The middle class didn't collapse. It was carefully, methodically, philosophically dismantled. And the most disturbing part? You helped. Every economic system requires sacrifice. What made the 20th century's social contract so revolutionary and so temporary was that it promised to sacrifice nothing. A home, a car, education for your children, healthcare, retirement, security. The American dream, they called it, though every nation built its own myth around the same architectural lie. The middle class was never supposed to be permanent. It was a holding pattern, a sedative, a beautifully constructed delay mechanism designed to answer one question: how do you keep people hopeful enough to work, but desperate enough never to stop? The answer was ingenious. You give them almost enough. Consider the psychological architecture of that proposition. Almost enough to feel secure, but not enough to feel free. Almost enough to retire comfortably, but not enough to retire early. Almost enough to give your children opportunities, but not enough to guarantee their futures. Almost enough to afford healthcare, but not enough to ignore the bills. This almost enough isn't an accident of market forces or political incompetence. It's the most sophisticated behavioral control mechanism ever devised. A financial treadmill calibrated precisely to your endurance, always adjusting its speed to keep you running without ever letting you arrive. Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest humans ever to calculate compound interest, once said something that should have caused riots. There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. He didn't whisper this in a smoke-filled room. He said it to a reporter, on the record, with the casual confidence of someone describing the weather. What makes this statement so psychologically devastating isn't its content, it's its reception. The statement made headlines for approximately 18 hours, then vanished into the cultural noise. Why? Because acknowledging it would require confronting an unbearable truth. You are not a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. You are a deliberately maintained participant in your own extraction. The middle class emerged from a very specific historical moment, a brief, unstable convergence of factors that made exploitation inefficient. Post-war America needed consumers to absorb mass production. Unions had actual leverage. The wealthy, terrified by the specter of communism and recent revolutions, accepted a compromise: share enough to prevent upheaval. This wasn't generosity, it was strategic retreat. And the moment those conditions evaporated, globalization, automation, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the compromise was systematically revoked. Not through a single policy or dramatic collapse, but through 10,000 small adjustments, each individually justifiable, collectively devastating. Here's where it becomes deeply personal. You were taught to measure your worth by your productivity, your security by your employability, your success by your ability to afford the symbols of middle-class life. But these metrics weren't neutral. They were implanted. The house in the suburbs, the reliable car, the college degree. These weren't natural human desires. They were manufactured needs, carefully cultivated to require exactly one thing: continuous debt. Because debt isn't just an economic mechanism, it's a psychological leash. It transforms time into money and money into control. When you owe, you comply. When you comply, you don't rebel. When you don't rebel, the system perpetuates without friction. The German philosopher Theodor Adorno understood this with painful clarity. He observed that true totalitarianism doesn't require jackboots and propaganda. It requires comfort. It requires a population so invested in maintaining their current lifestyle, that revolution becomes psychologically unthinkable. You don't need to silence dissent when dissent requires sacrificing your mortgage payment. This is why the middle class had to exist, and why it had to disappear. It existed to demonstrate that compliance yields comfort. It disappeared to demonstrate that comfort was always conditional. Think about your own life for a moment. How many decisions have you made? Career choices, living situations, relationships, even values, based not on what you wanted, but on what you could afford. How many dreams have you quietly, privately downgraded to be realistic? That word, realistic, is the linguistic scar tissue of systematic suppression. It's the internalized voice of a system that needs you to limit yourself, so it doesn't have to limit you overtly. You've become your own warden, and the prison is so architecturally seamless, you've mistaken it for the natural topology of adult life. The behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman identified a cognitive bias he called loss aversion, the psychological principle that humans fear losing what they have more than they desire gaining something better. This isn't a flaw in human reasoning, it's the foundation of social control. The middle class was deliberately positioned at the exact threshold where loss aversion becomes paralyzing. Give someone just enough that they have something to lose, then make survival contingent on not rocking the boat. The result is a population that polices itself, that views radical change as threat rather than opportunity, that mistakes the exhaustion of running in place for the virtue of hard work. But here's the crack in the architecture. The system overplayed its hand. It extracted too much too quickly. It forgot that the middle class wasn't just an economic category. It was a story people told themselves about fairness, meritocracy, and progress. When that story becomes obviously, undeniably false, something dangerous happens. Not revolution, not yet, but something perhaps more destabilizing: the withdrawal of belief. People stop participating in the mythology. They stop pretending the game is fair. They stop internalizing their exploitation as personal failure. You see this everywhere now, don't you? The quiet epidemic of people simply opting out. Not dramatically, no manifestos, no movements, just the slow, steady refusal to continue participating in a system that demands everything and promises nothing. The gig economy, the side hustles, the digital nomads, the minimalists, the anti-work forums, the early retirement communities, these aren't lifestyle choices. They're symptoms of a collective psychological break. The moment when the anesthetic wears off and people finally feel the machinery grinding their lives into capital. Consider the actor Matthew McConaughey before his reconnaissance, before the Oscars, when he was trapped in a cycle of romantic comedies that made him wealthy but artistically hollow. He described a moment of clarity where he realized he'd become a very expensive prisoner. He stopped. For 20 months, he turned down every offer, walking away from millions, allowing the industry to forget him, risking permanent irrelevance. It was psychological suicide by Hollywood standards, but it was also the only path to freedom. He had to deliberately dismantle the machinery of success to discover what success even meant. This is the paradox you now face. The tools that built your current life, the degree, the job, the mortgage, the retirement account, are the same tools preventing you from living differently. To change the game, you have to risk losing what you've already invested. This is why most people don't. This is why the system endures. Not through violence or explicit coercion, but through the quiet terrorism of sunk costs. But let's go deeper, because there's another layer to this erasure that's even more psychologically insidious. The disappearance of the middle class wasn't just economic, it was semantic. The language itself was weaponized. Politicians still refer to middle-class values and middle-class families long after the actual middle class ceased to exist as a meaningful economic category. Why? Because the phrase has become a psychological placeholder, a way of addressing everyone while describing no one. It allows people earning $35,000 and people earning $350,000 to both identify as middle class, obscuring the actual distribution of wealth and power. This linguistic sleight of hand serves a crucial function. It prevents class consciousness. As long as you identify as middle class, you're encouraged to see your interests as aligned with those above you rather than those below you. You're taught to fear downward mobility more than resent upward extraction. You're more concerned about someone on welfare getting something they didn't earn than someone inheriting billions they didn't create. This isn't natural, it's engineered. And it works because it operates at the level of identity rather than interest. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called this symbolic violence, the way systems of power reproduce themselves not through force, but through the naturalization of arbitrary hierarchies. You don't think of yourself as exploited because you don't have the conceptual vocabulary to recognize exploitation. You have challenges and opportunities, setbacks and growth experiences. The system has colonized your inner language, translating structural violence into personal narrative. You're not being systematically extracted from. You're building character, paying your dues, climbing the ladder. But the ladder is an illusion. It always was. For every story of someone who climbed from poverty to prosperity, there are 10,000 stories of people who worked just as hard and remained exactly where they started. Malcolm Gladwell explored this in Outliers, demonstrating that success is less about individual merit and more about arbitrary advantages, birth dates, family wealth, cultural capital, historical timing. Yet we fetishize the exceptions and ignore the rule, because the exceptions justify the system. They allow us to believe in meritocracy while participating in oligarchy. Here's what's most disturbing. You already know this. Somewhere beneath the coping mechanisms and cultural conditioning, you've always known the game was rigged. You've felt it in the gap between your effort and your outcomes, in the exhaustion that never translates to security, in the nagging sense that you're running faster just to stay still. But knowing and acknowledging are different. Acknowledgement requires confronting the possibility that much of your life has been organized around a lie. That the sacrifices you made, the dreams you deferred, the time you traded, all of it might have been in service of a system that was never going to reward you the way it promised. This is the psychological crisis at the heart of late capitalism. Not poverty. Poverty has always existed. But the specific betrayal of having done everything right and discovering that right was a moving target, recalibrated in real time to ensure you never quite arrived. The social contract wasn't broken. It was always provisional, always subject to revision by parties you never agreed to empower. The middle class had to disappear because its existence posed a question the system couldn't answer. If prosperity is possible for many, why not for all? If we can create enough wealth to ensure comfortable lives for millions, why do we also create systems that make comfort precarious? The existence of a stable, secure middle class suggested that perhaps extraction wasn't necessary, that perhaps society could be organized around sufficiency rather than accumulation. That question was dangerous. So the middle class was gradually, systematically converted from a destination into a transitional state, something you pass through briefly on your way to either precarity or wealth, but never something you can maintain. Now look at where we are. 2 generations have come of age knowing they will likely be poorer than their parents. This represents a fundamental break in the narrative of progress that organized Western life for 2 centuries. The psychological implications are only beginning to surface. When the future promises less than the present, when hard work guarantees nothing, when education creates debt rather than opportunity, the entire motivational architecture of society collapses. Why save for a retirement you can't afford? Why have children you can't provide for? Why participate in systems that systematically disadvantage you? These aren't rhetorical questions. Millions are answering them through their choices. Birth rates are declining across developed nations. Marriage rates are falling. Traditional career paths are being abandoned. Religious participation is collapsing. These aren't separate trends. They're symptoms of the same underlying condition, the withdrawal of belief in the future the system promised. People aren't opting out because they've become lazy or entitled. They're opting out because they've done the math and realized the equation doesn't balance. But let's be clear about something. Understanding isn't salvation. Awareness doesn't automatically translate to freedom. In fact, one of the cruelest aspects of our current moment is that consciousness of the system often intensifies the pain without providing escape routes. You can see the machinery clearly and still be caught in its gears. This is why critique by itself is insufficient. This is why so many people who understand exactly what's happening still participate in their own diminishment. Because the alternatives seem either impossible or terrifying. Yet something is shifting. Not a revolution, those are too visible, too easily co-opted or crushed, but a slow, cellular-level transformation in how people relate to work, consumption, and identity. You see it in the proliferation of mutual aid networks, in the rejection of hustle culture, in the growing recognition that perhaps mental health crises and epidemic loneliness aren't personal failings, but rational responses to irrational conditions. The system is producing people it can no longer fully absorb. People whose educations taught them to think critically, but whose economies offer them only precarity. This is dangerous for power. Not because these people are revolutionary, but because they're ungovernable. They're too educated to believe the old mythologies and too economically marginal to have stakes in preserving the current arrangement. They have nothing to lose, which is another way of saying they have everything to reimagine. The disappearance of the middle class didn't create a vacuum. It created a strange new category of people who understand how the system works and have no interest in defending it. You might be one of them. You might be reading this while sitting in a job you tolerate, in a home you barely afford, maintaining a lifestyle that feels more like performance than preference. You might be one paycheck away from catastrophe, 2 medical emergencies from bankruptcy, 3 missed payments from homelessness. If so, you understand viscerally what economics textbooks describe abstractly. You are no longer middle class by any historical standard. You are the working poor with good credit scores. You are precarity with a college degree. You are the managed decline of the promise your parents believed in. But here's where it gets interesting. Your position, however uncomfortable, offers a unique vantage point. You can see both the mythology from the inside, you were raised believing in it, and the reality from outside, because you're living the gap between promise and outcome. This double consciousness, this ability to hold 2 contradictory truths simultaneously, is the beginning of something. Not certainty, not a clear path forward, but the destabilization of the narratives that kept the old order intact. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek talks about this as the moment before ideology collapses, when people can no longer ignore the contradiction between official narratives and lived experience. The system depends on your continued belief that your struggles are temporary, individual, solvable through personal adjustment. The moment you recognize that your struggles are structural, collective, and inherent to the system's design, that moment is when hegemony begins to fracture. We're in that moment now. Not universally, not evenly, but unmistakably. The disappearance of the middle class was supposed to be invisible, gradual enough that each generation would accept their diminished circumstances as normal. But the acceleration has made the process visible. People can now see, within a single lifetime, how the promise was rescinded. Parents who achieved stability watch their children struggle despite doing everything right. The intergenerational betrayal is making the systematic nature of the extraction undeniable. So what do you do with this knowledge? What do you do when you understand you're living through the managed dissolution of a social contract you never agreed to, never had the power to negotiate, and can't individually escape? The honest answer is, there's no script for this. No self-help book, no political movement, no personal optimization strategy that can solve a systemic crisis through individual action. And yet, individual action is all you have immediate control over. This is the existential bind. The problems are collective, but your life is singular. The solutions require coordination on a scale that seems impossible, but the suffering is immediate and personal. You can't wait for systemic change to feed your children or pay your rent. You have to navigate the world as it is, while yearning for the world as it should be. This tension doesn't resolve. It's the permanent condition of living through historical transformation. But perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the point isn't resolution, but refusal. The refusal to internalize your exploitation as personal failure. The refusal to accept precarity as inevitable. The refusal to stop imagining alternatives, even when alternatives seem impossible. This refusal doesn't manifest as dramatic gestures. It manifests in small, persistent acts of non-compliance. Working to live rather than living to work. Choosing sufficiency over status. Building community rather than portfolio. Measuring wealth in time and autonomy rather than dollars and possessions. These aren't solutions. They're survival strategies. But survival strategies, when adopted collectively, become culture. And culture, over time, becomes politics. The architect Frank Lloyd Wright once designed a building where he deliberately lowered the ceiling in the entry corridor to an oppressively cramped height. Visitors would feel compressed, uncomfortable, almost claustrophobic. Then they'd emerge into the main space where the ceiling soared, and the sudden expansion created a profound sense of relief and possibility. The constraint was purposeful. It made the freedom feel more dramatic by contrast. What if that's where we are now? What if the systematic compression of middle-class life, the narrowing of possibilities, the increasing precarity, what if all of that is actually the corridor, not the destination? That's not optimism. It's not a promise. It's simply a reminder that systems that seem permanent are often just persistent. And the difference between those two states is the moment when enough people stop believing in permanence. The ground beneath your feet isn't dissolving into nothingness. It's dissolving into potential, terrifying, vertiginous, but not yet determined. You stand at that threshold now. Behind you, the mythology of the middle class, that comfortable lie that traded security for compliance. Ahead, the unknown terrain of whatever comes next. You can't go back. The path has already collapsed. So the only direction is forward, into uncertainty, armed with nothing but the recognition that the old promises were always conditional, always revocable, and therefore never yours to begin with. You are a human being navigating a brief, precious existence in a universe that guarantees nothing. The system that promised to take care of you in exchange for your compliance never had the authority to make that promise. And its failure to deliver doesn't diminish you. It reveals the promise was fraudulent from the beginning. What do you build when you're no longer building toward a predetermined definition of success? What do you value when you're no longer measuring value in market terms? Who do you become when you're no longer becoming what the system needs you to be? These aren't comfortable questions. They don't have neat answers. But they're yours now, in a way they never were when you believed the script. The disappearance of the middle class is a catastrophe and a liberation. The catastrophe of losing a comforting lie, the liberation of no longer having to pretend it was truth. What you do with that freedom, however constrained by material conditions, is the only thing that was ever actually yours to determine. The photograph that doesn't exist, the one capturing the moment comfort became a crime, you don't need it anymore. You're living in the frame. You are the evidence. And what you do next is the only testimony that matters.